The real trouble with this world of ours is not that it is an unreasonable world, nor even that it is a reasonable one. The commonest kind of trouble is that it is nearly reasonable, but not quite. Life is not an illogicality, yet it is a trap for logicians. It looks just a little more mathematical and regular than it is. Its exactitude is obvious, but its inexactitude is hidden. Its wildness lies in wait. I give one coarse instance of what I mean. Suppose some mathematical creature from the moon were to reckon up the human body. He would at once see that the essential thing about it was that it was duplicate. A man is two men, he on the right exactly resembling him on the left. Having noted that there was an arm on the right and one on the left, a leg on the right and one on the left, he might go further and still find on each side the same number of fingers, the same number of toes, twin eyes, twin ears, twin nostrils, and even twin lobes of the brain. At last he would take it as a law, and then where he found a heart on one side, would deduce that there was another heart on the other. And just then, where he most felt he was right, he would be wrong. It is this silent swerving from accuracy by an inch that is the uncanny element in everything. It seems a sort of secret treason in the universe. An apple or an orange is round enough to get itself called round, and yet is not round after all. The earth itself is shaped like an orange in order to lure some simple astronomer into calling it a globe. A blade of grass is called after the blade of a sword, because it comes to a point, but it doesn't. Everywhere in things there is this element of the quiet and incalculable. It escapes the rationalists, but it never escapes till the last moment. From the grand curve of our earth it could easily be inferred that every inch of it was thus curved. It would seem rational that as a man has a brain on both sides, he should have a heart on both sides. Yet scientific men are still organizing expeditions to find the North Pole, because they are so fond of flat country. Scientific men are still organizing expeditions to find a man's heart, and when they try to find it, they generally get on the wrong side of him. Now, actual insight or inspiration is best tested by whether it guesses these hidden malformations or surprises. If our mathematician from the moon saw the two arms and the two ears, he might deduce the two shoulder blades and the two halves of the brain. But if he guessed that the man's heart was in the right place, then I should call him something more than a mathematician. Now, this is exactly the claim which I have since come to propound for Christianity, not merely that it deduces logical truths, but that when it suddenly becomes illogical, it has found, so to speak, an illogical truth. It not only goes right about things, but it goes wrong, if one may say so, exactly where the things go wrong. Its plan suits the secret irregularities and expects the unexpected. It is simple about the simple truth, but it is stubborn about the subtle truth. It will admit that a man has two hands. It will not admit, though all the modernists wail to it, the obvious deduction that he has two hearts. It is my only purpose in this chapter to point this out, to show that whenever we feel there is something odd in Christian theology, we shall generally find that there is something odd in the truth. I have alluded to an unmeaning phrase to the effect that such and such a creed cannot be believed in our age. Of course, anything can be believed in any age, but oddly enough, there really is a sense in which a creed, if it is believed at all, can be believed more fixedly in a complex society than in a simple one. If a man finds Christianity true in Birmingham, he has actually clearer reasons for faith than if he had found it true in Mercia. For the more complicated seems the coincidence, the less it can be a coincidence. If snowflakes fell in the shape, say, of the heart of Midlothian, it might be an accident. But if snowflakes fell in the exact shape of the maze at Hampton Court, I think one might call it a miracle. It is exactly as of such a miracle that I have since come to feel of the philosophy of Christianity. The complication of our modern world proves the truth of the creed more perfectly than any of the plain problems of the ages of faith. It was in Notting Hill and Battersea that I began to see that Christianity was true. This is why the faith has that elaboration of doctrines and details which so much distresses those who admire Christianity without believing in it. When once one believes in a creed, one is proud of its complexity, as scientists are proud of the complexity of science. It shows how rich it is in discoveries. If it is right at all, it is a compliment to say that it's elaborately right. A stick might fit a hole or a stone a hollow by accident, but a key and a lock are both complex, and if a key fits a lock, you know it is the right key. But this involved accuracy of the thing makes it very difficult to do what I now have to do, to describe this accumulation of truth. It is very hard for a man to defend anything of which he is entirely convinced. It is comparatively easy when he is only partially convinced. He is partially convinced because he has found this or that proof of the thing, and he can expound it. But a man is not really convinced of a philosophic theory when he finds that something proves it, and the more converging reasons he finds pointing to this conviction, the more bewildered he is if he asks suddenly to sum them up. Thus, if one asked an ordinary intelligent man on the spur of the moment, "Why do you prefer civilization to savagery?" he would look wildly round at object after object, and would only be able to answer vaguely, "Why, there is that bookcase, and the coals in the coal scuttle, and pianos, and policemen." The whole case for civilization is that the case for it is complex. It has done so many things. But that very multiplicity of proof which ought to make reply overwhelming makes reply impossible. There is, therefore, about all complete conviction a kind of huge helplessness. This belief is so big that it takes a long time to get it into action, and this hesitation chiefly arises, oddly enough, from an indifference about where one should begin. All roads lead to Rome, which is one reason why many people never get there. In the case of this defense of the Christian conviction, I confess that I would as soon begin the argument with one thing as another. I would begin it with a turnip or a taximeter cab. But if I am to be at all careful about making my meaning clear, it will, I think, be wiser to continue the current arguments of the last chapter, which was concerned to urge the first of these mystical coincidences, or rather ratifications. All I had hitherto heard of Christian theology had alienated me from it. I was a pagan at the age of 12, and a complete agnostic by the age of 16, and I cannot understand anyone passing the age of 17 without having asked himself so simple a question. I did indeed retain a cloudy reverence for a cosmic deity, and a great historical interest in the founder of Christianity, but I certainly regarded him as a man, though perhaps I thought that, even in that point, he had an advantage over some of his modern critics. I read the scientific and skeptical literature of my time, all of it, at least, that I could find written in English and lying about, and I read nothing else. I read nothing else on any other note of philosophy. The penny dreadfuls which I also read were indeed in a healthy and heroic tradition of Christianity, but I did not know this at the time. I never read a line of Christian apologetics. I read as little as I can of them now. It was Huxley and Herbert Spencer and Bradlaugh who brought me back to orthodox theology. They sowed in my mind my first wild doubts of doubt. Our grandmothers were quite right when they said that Tom Paine and the freethinkers unsettled the mind. They do. They unsettled mine horribly. The rationalist made me question whether reason was of any use whatever, and when I had finished Herbert Spencer, I had got as far as doubting, for the first time, whether evolution had occurred at all. As I laid down the last of Colonel Ingersoll's atheistic lectures, the dreadful thought broke across my mind, "Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian." I was in a desperate way. This odd effect of the great agnostics in arousing doubts deeper than their own might be illustrated in many ways. I take only one. As I read and reread all the non-Christian or anti-Christian accounts of the faith, from Huxley to Bradlaugh, a slow and awful impression grew gradually but graphically upon my mind, the impression that Christianity must be a most extraordinary thing. For not only, as I understood, had Christianity the most flaming vices, but it apparently had a mystical talent for combining vices which seemed inconsistent with each other. It was attacked on all sides, and for all contradictory reasons. No sooner had one rationalist demonstrated that it was too far to the east, than another demonstrated with equal clearness that it was much too far to the west. No sooner had my indignation died down at its angular and aggressive squareness, than I was called up again to notice and condemn its enervating and sensual roundness. In case any reader has not come across the thing I mean, I will give such instances as I remember at random of this self-contradiction in the skeptical attack. I give 4 or 5 of them. There are 50 more. Thus, for instance, I was much moved by the eloquent attack on Christianity as a thing of inhuman gloom, for I thought, and still think, sincere pessimism the unpardonable sin. Insincere pessimism is a social accomplishment, rather agreeable than otherwise, and fortunately nearly all pessimism is insincere. But if Christianity was, as these people said, a thing purely pessimistic and opposed to life, then I was quite prepared to blow up St. Paul's Cathedral. But the extraordinary thing is this. They did prove to me in Chapter 1, to my complete satisfaction, that Christianity was too pessimistic, and then, in Chapter 2, they began to prove to me that it was a great deal too optimistic. One accusation against Christianity was that it prevented men, by morbid tears and terrors, from seeking joy and liberty in the bosom of nature. But another accusation was that it comforted men with a fictitious providence and put them in a pink and white nursery. One great agnostic asked why nature was not beautiful enough and why it was hard to be free. Another great agnostic objected that Christian optimism, the garment of make-believe woven by pious hands, hid from us the fact that nature was ugly and that it was impossible to be free. One rationalist had hardly done calling Christianity a nightmare before another began to call it a fool's paradise. This puzzled me. The charges seemed inconsistent. Christianity could not at once be the black mask on a white world and also the white mask on a black world. The state of the Christian could not be at once so comfortable that he was a fool to stand it. If it falsified human vision, it must falsify it one way or another. It could not wear both green and rose-coloured spectacles. I rolled on my tongue with a terrible joy, as did all young men of that time, the taunts which Swinburne hurled at the dreariness of the creed. Thou hast conquered, O pale Galilean, the world has grown grey with thy breath. But when I read the same poet's accounts of paganism, as in Atalanta, I gathered that the world was, if possible, more grey before the Galilean breathed on it than afterwards. The poet maintained, indeed, in the abstract, that life itself was pitch dark, and yet, somehow, Christianity had darkened it. The very man who denounced Christianity for pessimism was himself a pessimist. I thought there must be something wrong, and it did for one wild moment cross my mind that perhaps those might not be the very best judges of the relation of religion to happiness who, by their own account, had neither one nor the other. It must be understood that I did not conclude hastily that the accusations were false or the accusers fools. I simply deduced that Christianity must be something even weirder and wickeder than they made out. A thing might have these two opposite vices, but it must be a rather queer thing if it did. A man might be too fat in one place and too thin in another, but he would be an odd shape. At this point my thoughts were only of the odd shape of the Christian religion. I did not allege any odd shape in the rationalistic mind. Here is another case of the same kind. I felt that a strong case against Christianity lay in the charge that there is something timid, monkish, and unmanly about all that is called Christian, especially in its attitude towards resistance and fighting. The great skeptics of the 19th century were largely virile. Bradlaugh in an expansive way, Huxley in a reticent way, were decidedly men. In comparison, it did seem tenable that there was something weak and over-patient about Christian councils. The gospel paradox about the other cheek, the fact that priests never fought, 100 things made plausible the accusation that Christianity was an attempt to make a man too like a sheep. I read it and believed it, and if I had read nothing different, I should have gone on believing it. But I read something very different. I turned to the next page in my agnostic manual, and my brain turned upside down. Now I found that I was to hate Christianity not for fighting too little, but for fighting too much. Christianity, it seemed, was the mother of wars. Christianity had deluged the world with blood. I had got thoroughly angry with the Christian because he never was angry, and now I was told to be angry with him because his anger had been the most huge and horrible thing in human history, because his anger had soaked the earth and smoked to the sun. The very people who reproached Christianity with the meekness and non-resistance of the monasteries were the very people who reproached it also with the violence and valor of the Crusades. It was the fault of poor old Christianity, somehow or other, both that Edward the Confessor did not fight, and that Richard Coeur de Lion did. The Quakers, we were told, were the only characteristic Christians, and yet the massacres of Cromwell and Alva were characteristic Christian crimes. What could it all mean? What was this Christianity which always forbade war and always produced wars? What could be the nature of the thing which one could abuse first because it would not fight, and second because it was always fighting? In what world of riddles was born this monstrous murder and this monstrous meekness? The shape of Christianity grew a queerer shape every instant. I take a third case, the strangest of all, because it involves the one real objection to the faith. The one real objection to the Christian religion is simply that it is one religion. The world is a big place, full of very different kinds of people. Christianity, it may be reasonably said, is one thing confined to one kind of people. It began in Palestine. It has practically stopped with Europe. I was duly impressed with this argument in my youth, and I was much drawn towards the doctrine often preached in ethical societies. I mean the doctrine that there is one great unconscious church of all humanity, founded on the omnipresence of the human conscience. Creeds, it was said, divided men, but at least morals united them. The soul might seek the strangest and most remote lands and ages and still find essential ethical common sense. It might find Confucius under eastern trees, and he would be writing, "Thou shalt not steal." It might decipher the darkest hieroglyphic on the most primeval desert, and the meaning, when deciphered, would be, "Little boys should tell the truth." I believed this doctrine of the brotherhood of all men in the possession of a moral sense, and I believe it still, with other things. And I was thoroughly annoyed with Christianity for suggesting, as I supposed, that whole ages and empires of men had utterly escaped this light of justice and reason. But then I found an astonishing thing. I found that the very people who said that mankind was one church, from Plato to Emerson, were the very people who said that morality had changed altogether, and that what was right in one age was wrong in another. If I asked, say, for an altar, I was told that we needed none, for men, our brothers, gave us clear oracles in one creed in their universal customs and ideals. But if I mildly pointed out that one of men's universal customs was to have an altar, then my agnostic teachers turned clean round and told me that men had always been in darkness and the superstitions of savages. I found it was their daily taunt against Christianity that it was the light of one people and had left all others to die in the dark. But I also found that it was their special boast for themselves that science and progress were the discovery of one people and that all other peoples had died in the dark. Their chief insult to Christianity was actually their chief compliment to themselves, and there seemed to be a strange unfairness about all their relative insistence on the two things. When considering some pagan or agnostic, we were to remember that all men had one religion. When considering some mystic or spiritualist, we were only to consider what absurd religions some men had. We could trust the ethics of Epictetus because ethics had never changed. We must not trust the ethics of Bossuet because ethics had changed. They changed in 200 years, but not in 2000. This began to be alarming. It looked not so much as if Christianity was bad enough to include any vices, but rather as if any stick was good enough to beat Christianity with. What again could this astonishing thing be like, which people were so anxious to contradict, that in doing so they did not mind contradicting themselves? I saw the same thing on every side. I can give no further space to this discussion of it in detail, but lest anyone supposes that I have unfairly selected 3 accidental cases, I will run briefly through a few others. Thus, certain skeptics wrote that the great crime of Christianity had been its attack on the family. It had dragged women to the loneliness and contemplation of the cloister, away from their homes and their children. But then, other skeptics, slightly more advanced, said that the great crime of Christianity was forcing the family and marriage upon us, that it doomed women to the drudgery of their homes and children, and forbade them loneliness and contemplation. The charge was actually reversed. Or again, certain phrases in the epistles or the marriage service were said by the anti-Christians to show contempt for women's intellect. But I found that the anti-Christians themselves had a contempt for women's intellect, for it was their great sneer at the church on the continent that only women went to it. Or again, Christianity was reproached with its naked and hungry habits, with its sackcloth and dried peas. But the next minute, Christianity was being reproached with its pomp and its ritualism, its shrines of porphyry and its robes of gold. It was abused for being too plain and for being too colored. Again, Christianity has always been accused of restraining sexuality too much, when Bradlaugh the Malthusian discovered that it restrained it too little. It is often accused in the same breath of prim respectability and of religious extravagance. Between the covers of the same atheistic pamphlet I have found that the faith rebuked for its disunion, one thinks one thing and one another, and rebuked also for its union. It is difference of opinion that prevents the world from going to the dogs. In the same conversation, a free thinker, a friend of mine, blamed Christianity for despising Jews, and then despised it himself for being Jewish. I wished to be quite fair then, and I wish to be quite fair now, and I did not conclude that the attack on Christianity was all wrong. I only concluded that if Christianity was wrong, it was very wrong indeed. Such hostile horrors might be combined in one thing, but that thing must be very strange and solitary. There are men who are misers and also spendthrifts, but they are rare. There are men sensual and also ascetic, but they are rare. But if this mass of mad contradictions really existed, Quakerish and bloodthirsty, too gorgeous and too threadbare, austere yet pandering preposterously to the lust of the eye, the enemy of women and their foolish refuge, a solemn pessimist and a silly optimist, if this evil existed, then there was in this evil something quite supreme and unique. For I found in my rationalist teachers no explanation of such exceptional corruption. Christianity, theoretically speaking, was in their eyes only one of the ordinary myths and errors of mortals. They gave me no key to this twisted and unnatural badness. Such a paradox of evil rose to the stature of the supernatural. It was, indeed, almost as supernatural as the infallibility of the Pope. An historic institution which never went right is really quite as much of a miracle as an institution that cannot go wrong. The only explanation which immediately occurred to my mind was that Christianity did not come from heaven, but from hell. Really, if Jesus of Nazareth was not Christ, he must have been Antichrist. And then, in a quiet hour, a strange thought struck me like a still thunderbolt. There had suddenly come into my mind another explanation. Suppose we heard an unknown man spoken of by many men. Suppose we were puzzled to hear that some men said he was too tall, and some too short. Some objected to his fatness, some lamented his leanness, some thought him too dark, and some too fair. One explanation, as has already been admitted, would be that he might be an odd shape. But there is another explanation. He might be the right shape. Outrageously tall men might feel him to be short. Very short men might feel him to be tall. Old bucks who were growing stout might consider him insufficiently filled out. Old beaux who were growing thin might feel that he expanded beyond the narrow lines of elegance. Perhaps Swedes, who have pale hair like tow, called him a dark man, while Negroes considered him distinctly blonde. Perhaps, in short, this extraordinary thing is really the ordinary thing, at least the normal thing, the centre. Perhaps, after all, it is Christianity that is sane, and all its critics that are mad, in various ways. I tested this idea by asking myself whether there was about any of the accusers anything morbid that might explain the accusation. I was startled to find that this key fitted a lock. For instance, it was certainly odd that the modern world charged Christianity at once with bodily austerity and with artistic pomp. But then it was also odd, very odd, that the modern world itself combined extreme bodily luxury with an extreme absence of artistic pomp. The modern man thought Beckett's robes too rich and his meals too poor. But then the modern man was really exceptional in history. No man before ever ate such elaborate dinners in such ugly clothes. The modern man found the church too simple, exactly where modern life is too complex. He found the church too gorgeous, exactly where modern life is too dingy. The man who disliked the plain fasts and feasts was mad on entrees. The man who disliked vestments wore a pair of preposterous trousers. And surely, if there was any insanity involved in the matter at all, it was in the trousers, not in the simply falling robe. If there was any insanity at all, it was in the extravagant entrees, not in the bread and wine. I went over all the cases, and I found the key fitted so far. The fact that Swinburne was irritated at the unhappiness of Christians, and yet more irritated at their happiness, was easily explained. It was no longer a complication of diseases in Christianity, but a complication of diseases in Swinburne. The restraints of Christians saddened him simply because he was more hedonist than a healthy man should be. The faith of Christians angered him because he was more pessimist than a healthy man should be. In the same way, the Malthusians by instinct attacked Christianity, not because there is anything especially anti-Malthusian about Christianity, but because there is something a little anti-human about Malthusianism. Nevertheless, it could not, I felt, be quite true that Christianity was merely sensible and stood in the middle. There was really an element in it of emphasis and even frenzy which had justified the secularists in their superficial criticism. It might be wise, I began more and more to think that it was wise, but it was not merely worldly wise. It was not merely temperate and respectable. Its fierce crusaders and meek saints might balance each other. Still, the crusaders were very fierce, and the saints were very meek, meek beyond all decency. Now, it was just at this point of the speculation that I remembered my thoughts about the martyr and the suicide. In that matter there had been this combination between two almost insane positions, which yet somehow amounted to sanity. This was just such another contradiction, and this I had already found to be true. This was exactly one of the paradoxes in which skeptics found the creed wrong, and in this I had found it right. Madly as Christians might love the martyr or hate the suicide, they never felt these passions more madly than I had felt them long before I dreamed of Christianity. Then the most difficult and interesting part of the mental process opened, and I began to trace this idea darkly through all the enormous thoughts of our theology. The idea was that which I had outlined touching the optimist and the pessimist, that we want not an amalgam or compromise, but both things at the top of their energy, love and wrath both burning. Here I shall only trace it in relation to ethics, but I need not remind the reader that the idea of this combination is indeed central in Orthodox theology, for Orthodox theology has specially insisted that Christ was not a being apart from God and man, like an elf, nor yet a being half human and half not, like a centaur, but both things at once, and both things thoroughly, very man and very God. Now let me trace this notion as I found it.